I'm so aware of wanting to be a good mother and wanting to break some of the patterns that my mother had and her mother. And I don't want to lose myself to motherhood. Like, I still want to be Lindsay. I still have ambition. I still want to go do things in the world and help people. The reckoning really woke me up to, okay, how do all these things play in life? You know, because I have a finite amount of time. I want to do both of these things well. And the only way I'm going to be able to do any of that is just to be honest with myself and with the people around me that I want both things.
I'm Matt Tate, founder of Decimal and fellow entrepreneur. Yes, I'm one of the crazy ones. I've chosen time and time again to hustle my way through that first million. Now, I'm scaling to the next 50. So I know firsthand what the messy middle is really like. And I know that entrepreneurs and leaders like us need a destination for empowerment, community, and encouragement. This is our place. This is After the First Million. Welcome to After the First Million. I'm Matt Tate, your host, and today I'm really excited to have a conversation with Lindsay Roselle. You guys are going to be excited to hear about Lindsay because she's a multiple-time entrepreneur. She's worked in all types of businesses, but I think one of the really special things about her is her mission to really help talk about and work with high-achieving mothers as they balance being a mom and trying to be good at that with also having ambition. Lindsay, welcome to After the First Million.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, so I like to start with is one question. As you and I both know, you have to be a little bit crazy to start or run your own business. When did you know you were one of the crazy ones?
You know, that's a good question. I feel like I've always felt different, even since I was a kid. I don't know that I knew it was about starting a business, although my dad is an entrepreneur too. And so I think I always lived in that awareness that there was a way of doing things differently. And when you had ideas, it didn't have to just be an idea that went into the ether. It could be an idea that you pursued. And I watched my dad do that as a kid. And so it probably stems a lot there. But I, as an individual, always felt different in the ways that I feel like entrepreneurship requires you to be different. I was always more bold and more outgoing and more willing to ask a harder question of somebody. You know, even in school, I look back at, I'm the person who has kept all my stuff from school, even when elementary school, report cards and things like that are in a binder my mom kept. And there's comments of she's so engaged. She asks great questions. She's a teacher favorite, essentially. And I think a lot of that was my wiring, of course, to be an achiever, but a lot of it was curiosity to learn and really loving to learn and being really interested in understanding how things worked and so that I could get better at it. And that innate curiosity, I think, has been in me always. And I think for entrepreneurship, so much of what makes you not necessarily successful, but makes you stick with it is that trust that you have in yourself to I'll figure it out. And I think I had that so young, this understanding of how to figure things out and how to make things work, even if they were really hard or I didn't have all the ingredients to be, good at it right off the bat. And then, I think as I grew into an adult, the entrepreneurship stuff and the little bit of crazy in me comes from risk tolerance. And I don't know exactly how I developed risk tolerance other than maybe the easiest way to say it is just unwavering self-belief. I know I can figure it out, and I see that big reward comes from big risk. And that has played out so many times in my own microcosm of a life and also just on the big world stage. And I think I learned that in my teen years and in my corporate career in my early 20s, watching big risk equal big reward and playing it safe equal small reward and playing it safe equaling boring or playing it safe equaling what's the point, and so risk tolerance became something that I really lived into as an entrepreneur. And I think that's a lot of what we label as crazy to start a business. It really comes down to high risk tolerance, which is edgy for a lot of people because our culture is not really set up for risk tolerance. Our culture is very much set up for play it safe, and only certain people take big risks. And those are, the crazy ones. And that curiosity factor, I think people that are curious about stuff sometimes get labeled as crazy because you're why do you care? You've got a good job. Why are you tinkering with this? Why would you want to leave this comfortable situation and go do something that's unpredictable. Maybe I am crazy, but I'm sure it stems from my childhood. But I think I came into entrepreneurship with that craziness like very naturally. And I'm not like a wildly successful entrepreneur. There's people way more successful than me in entrepreneurship, but I've been able to do it over and over and over again. And when things have failed, I have been able to start over and find success again, you know, and I've just never stopped believing that I was capable of figuring it out. And I think ultimately that's what entrepreneurship requires.
Well, I think you've hit on a couple of really core tenets of, I would say, leadership and entrepreneurship. Number one is curiosity. And curiosity, though, I really feel like, and I'm sure you've seen this too, where that's also the sign of a really good team member and employee. The more we can screen for curiosity, the better teams we build. People that are just willing to dive deeper, ask why. Now, you also hit on the, I would say, risk, but the reality of like successful entrepreneurs, there's a calculated part to that. Like we all talk about the risk, like we're willing to jump off the diving board and make it into the pool, or what is it, jump out of the airplane and build the parachute on the way down there. A million fun analogies out there. But there's a calculated part to it. And I asked the question, when did you know you were one of the crazy ones? First thing everybody says is, when I thought I was going to be an entrepreneur. Like when I thought I was crazy enough to take the risk, to make the jump away from the cozy job, away from, you know, all of that. But the reality of entrepreneurship is the crazy part is running and growing a company and all of the emotional and mental roller coaster that goes with that, in being a leader of something that you're also building and changing and adapting. So with that in mind, talk about your first foray into entrepreneurship, because I feel like you have a lot of really cool experiences in starting new things.
Yeah. So I was always the person, even when I had a corporate career in my 20s, I had a lot of little side hustles. I still to this day have like little side hustles, but I think my brain is just wired to think in opportunity. And I'll say at the same time, I had great advice from a therapist that I saw in my 20s who said, you don't need to monetize all your hobbies. You're allowed to like to do something and not need it to make money. And that was also really confronting to me. And so all of this is kind of, I'll say that up front, like I've monetized a lot of things in my life. And every time I have an idea, I go down the path of how could I turn this into a business? And that's just how I'm wired. And that's not good advice for everyone. It's probably not good advice even for me, because sometimes the things you love to do and that you're good at should be left to be for pleasure and for joy and not for money. But that being said, my first like real official, had an EIN, made money, had a P&L, had people working at it business was a yoga studio. And I've always been into yoga since I was in my early teens. I did it on VHS at home in the 90s, if you'll believe it. But I did yoga teacher training in 2010. And I did it through like a corporate studio that has many locations all over the United States. And where I live in Colorado, that was the only yoga studio in town, really. And I lived on the other side of town. And I was like, man, I wish there was a yoga studio closer to where I lived. And then within a couple of weeks, I was like, obviously, I'll just start one. That was really a journey through the fundamentals of entrepreneurship, because it's a local business. So it needed a brick and mortar, space. We had to have a lease. We had to do a build out. And then local business, you have to find customers and you have to retain those customers. You have to have teachers. So we opened that in the spring of 2012, and it was open and successful all the way until COVID, till we were mandated to close. And because of mandates, we're never able to really reopen because of COVID. But that was, having a local business, I think, gave me entrepreneurial chops that a lot of people in the online business world will never experience, or even in tech will never experience, because your market is pretty limited. You can really only sell in a truly local services business like a yoga studio. You can only sell to people local. Like you have a finite market, and you're competing against other very similar offerings. You can differentiate yourself, but there's finite membership, finite customer base, and finite geography. And so that was a marketing challenge, unlike what I face now, where I have unlimited potential customers. And then managing people. That was my first time really ever managing people. And it's in the health and wellness industry. So you're dealing with people who aren't necessarily great employees, and like, no shade, but it's just a well-known fact that, yeah. So there was a lot of challenge there in a low margin business. There wasn't a lot of, it's not a high profit business with that much overhead. And so the things I learned there coming out of a corporate career where I had learned a lot about big business and software and tech, and then coming into local business, I feel like I swung from one end of the spectrum to the other. And then everything I've done since then has been much more online business focused or coaching and consulting focused, where it was way easier to control overhead, way easier to scale, much broader market base, and more in alignment with how I operate, which is like, I'm going to pour everything into something until I don't want to do it anymore. And then I'm going to go on to the next thing. With a local business that had a brick and mortar and a signed lease, as soon as when I was ready to move on to the next thing in like 2015, 2016, I still had this brick and mortar business that needed someone to run it and needed managed. And I started to feel weighed down by it to an extent, because I wanted to move on to the next thing. And that's not something you easily close or move on from. So that was my first foray truly into entrepreneurship, was a local yoga studio.
When you think about the yoga studio, I've talked to a lot of people in hospitality, in the kind of health and wellness, that local. And I feel like as they evolve into, as you mentioned, more scalable businesses, or in your case, kind of the more online, even service-based side with coaching, there are parts that they take away from it. And they usually have to do with kind of a service-based mantra or understanding, and then also something around managing people. Part of it is usually, I never want to manage that type of person again. But another part is just how they've adapted their style to, as a result of that. Have you taken any of that from the yoga studio management that you apply today, or kind of helped with that evolution for you?
My stepmom actually was my general manager, and she did a lot of the day-to-day management of that business, because for most of that business, I still had a corporate job where I was, or for a while in that business, I was traveling a lot, and then I had kids, and so she really ran the day-to-day. My experience with managing people in that business was mostly secondary. She did a lot of the direct management, but I had a lot of annoyance and resentment towards how hard people were to manage for what seemed to be an easy job. I'm like, you got to show up and you got to teach a yoga class. Like, why is this so hard? But now 10 years later, and I manage a big team of full-time employees who are very dedicated to their jobs and love their jobs. And I see them like, okay, a lot of what you're managing is not the job, you're managing the person. And, I think a lot of what used to annoy me, or what I perceived to be lack of commitment, was what stuff happening in their lives that I wasn't aware of. And I didn't take the time to get to know them. I didn't take the time to appreciate them as a human and understand how this work fit into their lives. And now in my role as COO, I do that, and I know all my employees really well, and I understand what's going on in their lives, and I have very deep compassion for when performance is affected by something happening personally. And so that's a big takeaway from that. I just don't think I would have had the awareness 10 years ago managing yoga teachers or the maturity, to care about them and to take the time to know them well enough to understand what was going on in their lives.
So when you were running that yoga studio, and you mentioned already that you always have a side hustle or 10, and you had started and begun starting another business, but it also seems like it was during that time that was when you mentioned you first had kids.
Yep.
And became a mom. And that's a turning point, literally. It's impossible for that not to be a turning point in everybody's life, moms and dads. But it seems like there was a part of that, and part of being a mom with ambition, that has led to a general theme in your life that's been very transformative from that point forward. What was the first couple of steps, and how did that kind of come about?
The real truth of it is the awareness of how it was affecting me wasn't there in the beginning. I much more operated as, I'm going to continue at the pace and at the level of dedication to work I've always been, and I'll just fit the kid in, like I'll make motherhood work in the context of everything else that I already do. And that led to problems. I mean, that definitely reared its head down the road when things fell apart in 2020. But when I got pregnant with our first child, it was fall of 2016. And so I had the yoga studio, I had a consulting company. I was also running events for what would become the bigger company that I was going to work on and was launching nationwide when COVID hit in 2020. But that business started locally. And I was doing all those things. And I was like, oh, I'm pregnant. Okay, I have 9 months. Like, I'll just keep working at this pace until I have him. And then once I have him, he'll just be my little sidekick. Like, I worked from home, so my perception initially was like, oh, I didn't have any friends that had kids. Like, I really hadn't spent any time around women like me who went from complete control over their schedules, the ability to work from sun up to sun, till 6 a.m. to midnight or whatever. I did work that way. I did run my life that way. I was like, I'll do what I want. I do it on my time. I work as much as I want, and I love to work. And I just assumed initially I would be able to just have Sawyer, my son, tag along, like, how hard can a baby be? Which is funny now to even hear those words, come out of my mouth. And, in the first few months when they're little blobs that just cuddle with you and sleep all the time, like, I was like, oh, I can totally do this. I don't know why people complain about this. This isn't that hard. And then he kind of woke up around 3 months old and started to not sleep as well and started to, fuss if I put him down, or I would be on calls and he'd get hungry in the middle of a call. And I'm like on a Zoom trying to keep him below the camera level, hold a bottle for him, and keep presenting, keep leading my team that I had a very large consulting contract with a publicly traded company. And they knew I had had a baby, but like, I kept billing hours, like I worked straight through. And so they didn't really have an awareness that I didn't have childcare or anything like that. And, so I was able to hold on for a couple months before I realized this is not sustainable. And in order to work and provide for my family, I'm going to have childcare. Like I can't do both of these things well. And so at that time, my solution was just like, get childcare, which I did. And my partner he has a business too, but he works out of the home. So he wasn't able, he managed a team and he wasn't really able to do a lot of childcare. So it defaulted to me. So we brought a nanny in. So through that whole season from 2016 through early 2020, because I had a second child in mid 2019, it felt like that. It felt like, okay, just keep working. Work is the constant. The babies are going to get fit into the work schedule. And then we get childcare to watch the baby so that I can work. And it was really that energy I felt around like someone else has to take care of the kids so I can work. And then when 2020 hit, of course, that really got flipped on its head and the businesses got kind of ripped away and childcare became obviously less predictable. We still had pretty solid childcare through COVID, but it blew everything up in my mind around how am I supposed to do this? How am I supposed to want to work and want to be a good mom? I cannot do both of these things at the same time, especially when I didn't have childcare and both kids were home. And at this point I had like a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And it's like the most intense time of parenting ever. And it became this reckoning, which we could talk about, but it was this major reckoning around my identity of even my early years of motherhood, those first few years, I still was so focused on work and motherhood or parenting as I thought of it at that point. I wasn't even really in the awareness of motherhood. It was more like, oh, I'm a parent. I need to keep these kids alive. I'm going to get some childcare to watch them so I can keep working. And it was like that simple. And I think now after 2020 and my identity reckoning and everything I've learned about myself and about motherhood, now it's so much deeper in how I consider the dynamics between ambition and work and desire to have my own identity that achieves stuff in the world and being a mother and the energy of motherhood and how that factors in my life.
So one of the things that you and I have talked about is when we were doing prep for this call, you mentioned how you grew up as a high achiever and then you were a D1 athlete. And I can empathize with a lot of that. And even with that, baseball was my sport. And I loved baseball. And I love baseball as an example of life because you fail 70% of the time and you're still very successful. And that feels a lot like entrepreneurship and life to me. But even though that had been ingrained in me and growing up around entrepreneurs, really, really, really deep down failing at something didn't happen to me until 2018. And I had a company. I'd been successful in the past, but I had a company that totally bombed. I always tell people it was a better idea than it was a business, but it was fun to do while it lasted. And since Decimal, we've grown very well and applied a lot of learnings from that. But like you, I had a major reckoning and hit rock bottom as a result of having a very serious failure and tying my identity so much to that. And then I apply COVID, and my wife and I both, we had young kids a lot like yours. And talk a little bit about your reckoning, because there was a lot in work of failures. But as you mentioned earlier, other parts of it, like life doesn't stop, period.
Yeah.
And it all seemed to have hit you at once.
It did.
Do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah. There's like the adage that like the universe is going to keep nudging you until you listen. And if you don't listen, it's going to punch you in the face, for lack of a better word.
No, I think that's
how
very
it felt. Yeah. It felt like I'd had nudges along the way that felt like I was out of alignment, or I knew I didn't want to be doing the yoga studio anymore. And I knew I was, my consulting business was what was financially supporting us. And I was making good money there, but it was dollars for hours. I had to bill hours, and I knew I had awareness around this is heavily dependent on me. Like if I don't work or I can't work because a kid is sick or I'm sick or I don't, God forbid I try to take a maternity leave, which I didn't because I couldn't, I wouldn't have been able to bill. And so I had these nudges along the way and I ignored them because I think I didn't have, I know I didn't have awareness around what I was feeling internally. Like I really couldn't feel it. I just did. I just executed. I just worked, And in 2020, a lot of stuff happened, in the beginning of that year where that just dominoed. It was like I raised some money. I hired a bunch of people to relaunch this business nationally. And they like everybody's first day was March 15th. And we were supposed to launch by April or May and the world just collapsed, And so I had just hired all these people. COVID starts, I have this huge payroll and then I'm like, well, I can't fire everybody because they all just quit other jobs to come to work for me. And surely this is only going to be the 2 weeks, and like, had I known, obviously I would have just fired everybody and been like, sorry. I can say that now because I would have not felt bad about it knowing what was going to happen, but obviously we couldn't see what was coming and how long it would last. But basically, it just starts to domino over those first 6 months of COVID of 2020, where I'm bleeding money out of the business that could potentially still be operating. We tried to pivot to go online, but everybody I had hired was all from the local business arena. And we're all trying to like help local businesses, but all these local businesses we were trying to help are all shut down. There's just no paradigm for this. Like there's none of us know what we're doing. And all over the country, different rules were applying different places. And so ultimately I had no choice but to kind of close that business, fire everybody. But I ran out of money, paying their payroll for the year, 8 months of the year, with literally none of them really able to do much. And at the same time, the yoga studios closed, mandated to be closed. So we're just bleeding money because our landlord was a big corporate landlord, did not have any rent forgiveness. And there was no mandate to, help a small business who couldn't, I was mandated to close by the governor of Colorado. And so by August or so of 2020, it was bad. Both businesses were closed. I had no income. I'm always a figure it out person. So I got back into coaching and I was able to get coaching clients again and at least cover like basic bills. And at the same time, my partner's, his mom had died of cancer right as COVID started. Coincidentally, she'd been diagnosed and chosen not to treat it. And so, but it meant that he couldn't go see, he couldn't say goodbye. He couldn't go to a memorial service for many, many months. His business suffered too because of COVID. And so there's just a lot of stuff bubbling under the surface that ended up exploding in our relationship ultimately towards the end of 2020. And when that all happened, we separated. And that was kind of the cataclysm of the impetus to go work on myself, because I sat there in that moment and I felt this, like, I don't even know, like in a movie, it would be like the slow motion explosion, and it's like, okay, I can react. I can blame him and I can put it all back on him because he initiated the separation, and I can make it his problem. and blame him and not take any responsibility, or I can just sit here and be incredibly uncomfortable, but figure it out for myself and make sure I survive this. And that's what I chose to do, and make sure my children survive this. And so, and because of COVID, it was kind of this opportunity to just go into the cocoon. And so for me, the reckoning was this cocooning phase prompted by a separation from my partner. And we ended up working through it, and we're back together and good now. But for that initial timing was all like the 6 months, like end of 2020 into mid 2021 was me alone. And I think that was the first time in my whole life I'd ever been alone with myself. And, I had young kids, but really I would get up early in the morning and journal and read and dig it deep and deeper and deeper and excavate all of this like metaphorical shit that would lived within me for my whole entire life of basically being completely, emotionless, like just an achiever that went out and got things done and didn't really care about anything, like it's weird to say that, but I really do look back on myself during those times, and it's like I didn't really care about a lot. I just wanted to work. I wanted to achieve. I wanted to prove that I could do things to myself, but I wasn't super cognizant of the layers outside of myself. And so that reckoning was when I really realized like there's things in me that are wired from childhood, and there's these voices in my head around achievement and around motherhood and being a woman and the suffering that comes with being a parent or a mother and all these things that like aren't actually my voice. This is so weird. And as I excavated, I became more and more aware of this is generational trauma. This is ancestral trauma. This is stuff that I'm hearing it in my mom's voice. I'm hearing it in my grandmother's voice, like weird, and like the more inner work stuff that I read and did, the more awareness I had that there was so much, how loud it was. And I had numbed a lot of that and quieted a lot of that to survive and to achieve. And as all that sound came back and all these voices came back and this inner awareness came in me, I was like, okay, there's a lot of work to do here. And so I did that work in 2021 and 2022. And that's where a lot of this kind of grappling with identity as an entrepreneur and as someone that has a lot of ambition, that's where a lot of that started to come into my awareness and something that I could understand about myself and also play with a little bit, to be like, I'm so aware of wanting to be a good mother and wanting to break some of the patterns that my mother had and her mother. And I don't want to lose myself to motherhood. Like I still want to be Lindsay. I still have ambition. I still want to go do things in the world and help people. The reckoning really woke me up to, okay, how do all these things play in life? Because I have a finite amount of time. I want to do both of these things well. And the only way I'm going to be able to do any of that is just to be honest with myself and with the people around me that I want both things. And sometimes one is going to take precedent over the other, and that's just going to have to be okay. And I had to become aware of that and okay with that internally initially. And then I had to start communicating that to my partner. Then I had to start communicating that to, the layers and layers and layers outward. I think the reckoning for people comes in lots of different ways, and it can be explosive or it can be little nudges over a long amount of time. And sometimes it is a failure, or something you would label as a failure. And sometimes it's, a relationship or something like that. For me, it was kind of like all of them all at once. But I think for me, I was probably so numb that I needed, it had to be something that explosive to get my attention enough for it to actually change my life.
I don't know about you, but sometimes at the beginning, I used to wish that I wasn't the type of person that needed the punch in the face, but I'm also glad that I am, because I feel like it actually led to real change. And I don't know about you, but I feel like when I look back at that time, I don't feel like I was content and really had a chance to enjoy the stuff that was happening around me or the actual successes that I did have, because I was just always thinking about going forward. And I feel like so much more of today is like, I don't know, it's almost like there's more color in the world. I'm seeing things better.
Yeah.
And by your smile, I get the sense that you feel that too. Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it, I think. Once you wake up to this in yourself and you have these moments, and failure brings it on a lot for people. I think it's summed up in this understanding and awareness of something of meaning. I guess meaning is the word I use for it, where it's like just making money, just growing a business, just winning awards, just being known as somebody who's quote unquote successful doesn't mean that much to me. Like I think when I was in my 20s, that's all I wanted. And now I understand that like none of that means anything unless you're present in your life and you feel love and you give love and you can see the green in the trees and the blue in the sky and the pink in the flowers and marvel at how incredible it is to be alive. And I think a lot of that is a privilege for people like us who are achievers, who are constantly so focused on making things and building things and doing things, that slowing down to be present in the moment and appreciate stuff like that feels like wasted time, and now I'm like, I don't see those type of moments as wasted time. And I think it's such a subtle shift, but I think that's life. Like that's what we're here to be and do is appreciate the moments. And when we're high achievers running from one thing to the next, always seeking more, there's no time left for little moments.
Well, and I feel like too, when you open yourself up to have that bigger emotional impact one place, it opens you up to do it better in another place too. And when you're better with your kids, when you're better at home, when you're better with your significant other, it gives you the ability to be better at work with your team. And it opens up levels of empathy that you didn't have before. Because like you, I used to think of things that I would do at home as taking away. And like today, I canceled 2 meetings before this to take my 7-year-old daughter to breakfast because she broke her arm last Sunday. And I knew she wanted a good cry. And she totally wore rock star shades while we're sitting at breakfast because she didn't want people to see that she just cried. But we're talking about what she's going to do this summer that's also going to be awesome. It's going to be different, but what's going to be great. And I feel like those types of things open me up when on the way back, I got a call from an employee about a health thing. And I'm like, hey, you take whatever you need. How can we help? I don't care about work. Other people on the team will take it over. You do you. And I walk away and I'm like, you know what? That empathy, that conversation with Charlotte with the rock star shades at breakfast, and she got a bowl of marshmallows with pancakes. And so like, who doesn't love that? But it gave me a better ability to empathize with my team member too. And I really feel like those kind of openings, and I don't know about you, but I think the pandemic kind of untethered that barrier that we used to put between work and life and allowed so many of us to just say, it's all one. There's no like work and life divide and balance. It is just like work and life are together, and who we are, we balance throughout that.
I feel that exactly in alignment with what you said, that COVID kind of broke all of this open. And I also feel like the shadow side of that is now there's a little bit of this like softness in people where they, you're violating their boundaries if work is coming into personal time. And I'm like, well, work is personal. Personal is work. It's all connected when we work from home. So I don't like, I don't stand for those kind of excuses that I get to work from home and that I love my home. I love my home office. I love that my kids are here and my life is all here. And I have very low tolerance for my employees saying things like that to me. So I'm like, okay, there's two sides of this coin, and we'll just have to continue to navigate it as humans, as work evolves, and I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect, but that kind of stuff is, I think, will continue to be a struggle.
Oh, I think we're going to be unpacking a lot of this. I mean, unpacking how the pandemic has impacted the dynamic between employer and employee, the hybrid versus remote versus in office. Everything is changing, and we're not even close to settled. And I think we're not even close to settled on the evolutionary curve yet. But it'll be fascinating too as leaders to unpack and you saw this with your two businesses, the trauma that was being a boss during the pandemic, success or failure. Like, it was a really tough time. Now, with your reckoning, one of the things that I find really cool about you is, unlike me, I've shared my reckoning with my team and more the close circle. You chose to start a podcast and to have conversations and to share yours with a much broader and what became and is today a very successful audience. What made you take that leap? Because as a older millennial myself, it took people years to talk me into doing a podcast and getting out there on social media and all of that stuff, but you dove right in.
Yeah, I think it comes back to where we opened around being a little crazy. And I feel like I've always had the ability to see how everything connects and explain it, or at least understand it. And as I've gotten older, I have the vocabulary and the understanding of people to be able to explain things in a way that people understand. And I feel like coming out of 2020 and everything that happened to me and turning 40, I just have such a heightened level of like, I give no fucks. Like, I just don't really care what, like, I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to explain it. I'm going to connect all the dots for you. And if you don't like what you hear, then just don't listen. Like I just don't care nearly as much as I used to about what people think about me. And so all of those things compound together to, I think, for a podcast, make it a great medium for someone like me to go, I'm going to tell stories. I'm going to share my opinion. I'm going to talk to other people about what they're going through. And I'm going to ask these questions that I wish I had heard people talking about while I was going through it, so that I knew that I wasn't crazy, or, some of these confronting things that I say that would have woken me up, hopefully maybe would have woken me up before my life imploded, because there was no one saying this stuff to me. The only messages I ever heard were work, 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 or be a stay-at-home mom and give up work and go be a mother. And there wasn't this in-between conversation, which is an extremely nuanced conversation and has many, many stops along the spectrum of stay-at-home mother to full-time worker with a ton of childcare. And so, my mission in bringing the podcast forth was really to tell my stories, to hear other people's stories, to ask questions, and to start a conversation with women like me that were a few years behind me, who were heading into the turbulent era, heading into the implosion, and could potentially divert away from it. Like I imagine like the plane metaphor. It's like if I already flew through the thunderstorm and it was hell, and I barely survived, I'm going to call all the pilots behind me and be like, hey, you better go around this one. And here's all the ways that I would avoid this if I were you. And that's really what Motherload has felt like in all those conversations, was just like, I'm going to be really, really honest with you about how this happened, what I didn't see, what I did see, and what the truth is here, so that if you're feeling or sensing some of these things coming down the road for you, you can deal with it now before it becomes catastrophic. And so I like the podcasting platform for that. I'm also naturally outgoing, but not a coach. I mean, I do one-on-one coaching. I would rather teach you something and you go implement it and come back and talk to me about how it went. And then that's how I coach, versus I'm going to hold your hand along the way and be there every step. And I think podcasting is a great platform for someone like me in that way, where I can come in, I can download something, teach it, and someone can hear it, apply it, and come back, And so I would rather put effort into podcasting than a course or something like that, where I feel like this is a way of me being able to teach and for others to be able to consume it in the best way that works for me.
Well, and I don't know about you, I like stories. I've always been drawn, I'm a total nerd. So even in reading, I like biographies or autobiographies. I like the stories of what has happened versus the blueprint for how-to. I've never been a how-to reader. And podcasts, I feel like good podcasts are really about the story.
Yeah, true.
And tell me if you found this in doing your podcast, because one of the other fascinating things is your podcast led to your current job. Do you feel like as you've opened up to the conversations and been able to help tell stories and listen to stories, that it's also helped you and impacted you? In your goal to impact others, has it also been a mirror to you as well?
Oh, absolutely. When you study the brain and you study storytelling, which I have, the brain lights up when it hears a story, and you can be taught the same information in multiple ways. But if you're taught something as a story, lights the brain up in a whole different way. And so there's clearly biological reasoning that we're attracted to and engrossed in story, no matter what our life experience. Right. And so, yeah. And going through like my whole reckoning and awakening and all of that over the last few years, I read so much and I listened to so many podcasts and so much of especially inner work and personal development and like self-exploration is taught, quote unquote, through story, because it's a lot of personal testimony around hitting rock bottom, going through tragedy and growing out of it. And so the best way I found to learn a lot about that stuff was to read other people's stories of what they had been through and how they built resilience and came out of it. What's more helpful is to hear someone else's story of how they went through the daily work of grief or loss or failure or whatever, heartbreak, and what they did every day to repair themselves and to get back to feeling alive again. And you take a little nugget from it. You take some type of inspiration and you see yourself in them and you go, okay, they can do it. I can do it. And so, yeah, I think storytelling, I saw it so much in my stuff. And then I think story is also the way that I end up explaining a lot of things, and I think I learned that as a child too, was okay, people, I can see how it all connects. So I'll just tell a story about it and put it all in a story and people will understand what I'm saying. Or I'll relate it to a story and people will understand the metaphor or the takeaway I'm wanting them to have. And I naturally, my brain works in that way. And so I think with Motherload or in teaching what I teach now, or trying to bring what I learned about myself and turn it into something that other people could benefit from, sitting and talking with other people about their story, what is the best way to do it, because I can hear what they're saying and I can go, okay, yeah, what about this? Or yes, I had that experience too and it felt like this. Did it feel like that for you? And as they explore their own story, it gives that opportunity for the listener to see the mirror and go, oh, I see myself in her. Maybe they don't relate to Lindsay, but they relate to Natalie, or they relate to Catherine, or they relate to Mel, or like all these people I've interviewed, where some part of that person's story is the hook for you to go, oh, I am having a similar experience in my life. I want to listen to this. Now it feels like me. So yeah, story, I think all of us could benefit, if you have a podcast especially, but any kind of management of humans, whether they're your kids or they're your employees or they're your audience, if you're wanting to influence them, the best way to do it is with story, for sure.
My grandpa was a successful entrepreneur in his own right, and he would always tell us that stories are the best way to teach people. And then he'd laugh and say the story doesn't have to be true, the lesson just does.
Yeah, that's very true.
So, random question, and it just popped into my mind. When you think of your Motherload podcast, what are the 2 or 3 or 1 stories that you walked away from going, wow, that was awesome?
Yeah. Gosh, there's so many. I mean, a lot of what I've done 50 or 60 episodes, and now it's on hiatus because I'm on the BossBabe podcast, and we do bring a lot of the Motherload conversation into the BossBabe podcast. But of the episodes I recorded, I think the themes, I don't necessarily remember specific episodes or people, but the themes of this, like, my ambition is dead. Like coming into early motherhood and coming out of those first few weeks of fog, of just the like post-birth, postpartum literal fog, and kind of waking up a few months later and going, I don't feel ambition anymore. Like, I just want to be this baby's mother. Like, I don't want to do it. And this like really common, consistent theme with most people that I interviewed that are very successful by all measures, and had built big businesses before having babies, and are just, it's not even like actively that they want to blow it up. They're just like passively like, it just doesn't matter to me anymore. I just don't care about it. And then the reaction to that feeling of going, this is not good, that I'm a breadwinner. I have employees. I have thousands of customers. I make millions of dollars and I don't want it anymore. That theme came through so many times in interviews. And for most of those women, they fought that internally and they overrode it and they kept going. And then now I'm talking to them years down the road and they're burned out. They've had issues in the business. All these other things have come up, and it is like the universe giving you nudges until it punches you in the face kind of thing. And I just think it's so interesting, that conversation, because ambition always comes back. It comes back in a different way. But as you recover your identity and you get a little bit further out from that transition into motherhood, your individuality comes back. And I wish that more of us understood that when we make the transition into motherhood. It feels like it's permanent. It feels like you've lost yourself and now you're this new person, and that ambitious version of you don't recognize anymore, and you grieve her, right? And she's been lost, and hearing all these stories and having all these conversations was such a good reminder, and I hope such a good lesson to the listener, that that is such a common experience. And when you meet these people down the road, their ambition is back. It's different. They want to do different things. And sometimes it does mean that they blow up their business or they change what they're doing. But it doesn't mean that they are a shell of themselves and they never feel drive to achieve anything ever again, you know? And I think that theme felt very relatable to me and was so consistent across many, many, many conversations.
One theme that I want to pull out before we end here is, and I think it ties with motherhood, with business, sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you feel like that's the permanent phase.
Yeah.
And the reality of business, of life, is it changes. And it will change. Like this too shall pass. This phase will pass. Even the ones that you love. You and I talked earlier about how we both have 7-year-olds, and that's a fantastic phase to be a parent. And then they'll become teenagers. But it's the same with parenthood. I'm a father of twins, and my wife and I joke that the first 2 years of twins is like a black hole, and we see pictures and we don't remember it. Parenthood, motherhood is all a phase. Being a boss is a phase. And so my last question, now that you have transitioned into being the COO of a very great and a very good, bigger company that's in this messy middle, 8-figure brand, what, as you've been in the messy middle multiple times, what is one lesson that you pull out that you wish to share with people? Because you've touched on a lot during this podcast, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, you know, I think I'm 9-10 months into my role as COO, and I effectively run the company. Natalie is very focused on creation, like being the creator, being the visionary, all of that. And I think where I've landed on that question is, I sum it up as emotional neutrality, which maybe sounds cold, but you know, I think it's so important in management to be able to temper the emotional response to something happening and be able to look at the whole context and make the right choice. And I say it a lot in interviews and speaking and to my team. I say, you know, as COO, even as CEO, you know, you wear 3 hats. You wear the business hat. Like, what's the right choice for the business? And sometimes that choice has to win, and that's going to feel negative in these other realms, right? I wear the what's best for the team and the humans. What do the humans need? And sometimes I have to prioritize what one of the humans or all the humans need, and it's not as great for the business, but that's the priority. And I have to make that choice. And then there's this third hat that's like, what does the stakeholder need? Like, what does Natalie want and need? She's the founder of the business. She's the owner of the business. Sometimes what she wants and needs is also not what I would say the business is best for the business or is best for the team. I'm always looking at all 3 things. And I think anybody in a leadership role in a business, even if it's your own business, you are wearing all 3 of those hats. Even if it's your business, you're wearing, what do I want? What does the business want and need? And what does the team or, you know, the people want and need? And so for me, that's where I've learned the most, and where I think what makes me a great manager and a great leader is that I have the emotional neutrality to sit in all 3 of those seats at the same time and make hard choices, you know? And when I look at leaders and I'm like, okay, the ones that I think are good have that mastered, where they can weigh the business against the team, against the founder or the ownership, and know what the right decision is, make the right decision, stand behind the right decision, and then play the right decision out over the coming time.
And I think that's great advice, but I want to add to it because I think you innately do it, but you didn't give yourself credit for it. And it's something that I teach our team is, you have a 4th hat, and that's what's right for you.
Yeah.
And you always have to balance that, and that's okay. As a CEO, as a COO, as a team leader, whatever it is, you have that 4th hat, and it should always have the same weight as the others, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess the truth is you'll always have that flavor on top of everything, right? Because you're still a human making a decision. And do I always have a bias of which decision I want to make and what's best for me, or how each decision option plays out for me? Of course, you know, that's human nature. And so, yeah, that's a good insight. And I think as the leader of the business, if you start to make decisions that are out of alignment for you, it doesn't really matter about those other seats, because eventually it's all going to blow up anyway.
100%. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. This was awesome.
Thanks so much for listening. After the First Million is presented by Decimal. To listen to more episodes and find tips to help make running a business easier, visit decimal.com/AFM. Want to join the conversation? Reach out to me on LinkedIn and let's explore the messy middle.